Alright, well, now I'm reviewing Attica, the documentary. Came out last year. About the biggest prison riot in American history. It happened in 1971. I'm assuming the documentary came out about the 50th anniversary, probably. Just what I'm assuming. It's a very well-made documentary. And it kind of worked the same way a three-act structure movie would, just in that it starts with the riot and how it begins, then kind of goes back a little bit and kind of shows what the lead up to that was. The prisoners were being treated so awfully, they ended up just rebelling, basically. It shows how they survived, how they had to basically live like it was in war times, basically, just like setting up tents and digging out a latrine and finding supplies, food and water and everything, and they took like 20 captives from the prison guards, essentially, just to ensure that no one just came in and killed them all. But then at the end, after 4 days of this standoff, essentially, where the prisoners were basically just asking for human rights, so they weren't just treated like cattle, then the guards came in and killed them all. And they didn't discriminate between the prisoners and the captives. They just killed everyone. I mean, not everyone, because there were prisoners that were in the documentary who survived and stuff, and we're talking about it, but basically just a massacre at the end, and just shows just how easily power corrupts, I suppose. And I mean, it is Attica, so it's some of the most dangerous people in the world in there, but it was just it's the worst possible solution to this. But they just went ahead with it because the governor wanted to look like he wasn't soft on crime or some bullshit. This is one of those documentaries that's very powerful in the message that it's trying to convey. And it's also very good in that it shows this story in a very complete way that almost makes it feel like it's a real movie and not a documentary. Even though it is obviously a documentary, it still has the flow of an actual movie. And I would say it was very exciting in its own way. Well, it's very exciting throughout the whole movie, but it's also kind of horrifying in its own way. It has some good bits. I mean, there's a lot of bits there's a lot of scene and sequences that really were kind of uplifting in a lot of ways, and it kind of shows how resilient people can be when put in such extreme circumstances. It's also heartbreaking in a lot of ways. I mean, not just the ending, but just that how these people tried so hard, and then just in the face of a larger enemy, I mean, they could do nothing. There's nothing that can be done when something like this happens. And most of them were probably just forced into it, a riot starts happening, and some of them are just like, hey, I don't want to get involved, but now I am. It doesn't really talk about that, I'm just assuming. But this is the problems with things like this, I guess. This is the problem with our country in a way. Wealthy elite thinks that the lowest people without any power, they can just stomp all over them. And this demonstrates that in many ways. There's so much injustice in this world right now, even in this country, right? This just shows how awful things have become, And even the worst among us deserve the right to be treated like a human being, even in prison, right? I mean, because what they were doing to these people was basically torture. And then so much so that, it became so bad they rioted and took over the prison, essentially. But that's not good enough, right? Also, racism. There's tons of racism throughout this movie. Even at one point, after they started shooting prisoners, some of the guards were coming out being like, I want to go back in there. And then people started shouting, white power, just in the crowd, just out on the street. And it was just holy crap. And I don't think things have really gotten that much better than how they are now, or how they were shown in this movie anyway. It's this really terrible point in American history. And I didn't even know anything about it before I watched this documentary. But, we only like telling the good stories that we made up to our children in school. That was certainly true when I was a kid. There's this dark, incredibly racist section of American history that everyone just chooses to ignore. And it's incredibly true in our justice system right now. Our incredibly racist justice system that we're just letting to continue as it is, as it's always run. Straight into the ground. Okay, I'm going to be honest. When it comes to documentaries, I'm never really sure what to grade them on. So I usually just grade them on how interesting or how enjoyable I found them to be. I'm not a documentarian. I can't really like comment on like what they did correctly or incorrectly when compared to documentaries. Unlike with the fictional movies, I can say a lot about those, but I really only watch documentaries for the Oscars anyway, so I don't know. Let me think. I would say this was a very informative documentary. When I reviewed documentaries on my blog, I feel like for every single one I reviewed, somebody would come out of the woodwork to comment on my blog. That documentary was a total fabrication, and I was a piece of shit for saying it was a good documentary or whatever. It's like, I don't care if these are, like, completely honest or not. I mean, like, for most documentaries, it's only really possible to tell one side of the story. And really, I just care. Did I find it informative and interesting or fun in some way and entertaining? I don't care if it's real or not. So I'm going to say, before I rate this, I just thought of another point, and that's that I think this does a really good job of showing how the news always kind of blows things out of proportion or always swings to one side or the other when it comes to most stories, and then they just start painting one side as the bad guy and one side as obviously the good guy, and it's like this documentary kind of shows the opposite of what the news is doing then, and it usually just comes from who's in power, who has the money to like pay newscasters to say the side of the story they want them to. In this case, it's obviously the governor and the U.S. government, essentially just swinging the story to the way they want it to go until the American people see it as the National Guard being called in to quell an obvious threat instead of a horrible massacre that killed a bunch of innocent people, essentially. I mean, you can claim they're not innocent, but I would say for this situation, this is not what they deserved, considering what happened, because they were basically being peaceful. Like, one guard died, but he was somebody who was injured very early on and then died later in the hospital. But that turned it into like this whole fiasco that just blew way out of proportion and ended with many unnecessary deaths. But that's another problem with America, I think, just that we see the whole like eye for an eye or whatever the quote is, like we see revenge as being like a necessity almost. One person died, so 50 deaths should cover that. It's like, how is that just? One death shouldn't lead to more deaths. But that's not how they saw it then, and I doubt that's how many see it now. Okay, having said that, do I see any reason to like detract anything? Again, it's like I'm not a documentarian, so these will always be a little biased, I think, or like unbiased. No, that's not the right word. It's going to be flawed. I think my rating will always be flawed, because I'd probably just give this a 10 out of 10, just because I thought it was very informative, very well made, and I can't really detract for anything, outside of like it made me feel uncomfortable at points. That's not really the movie's fault, and it's like you're supposed to feel uncomfortable at those points, and if not, you're probably some kind of pervert or psychopath maybe, or a perverted psychopath. Yeah, I'd give it a 10 out of 10. I'll just do that. It's a very powerful documentary. I really enjoyed it in the way that you enjoy something like this. That's the wrong way to phrase that. I thought it was very interesting, fascinating, and horrifying in its own way. And it makes me really wish that the American government had a greater capacity for change, I guess. Alright, I guess that's it. Please like and subscribe. You're supposed to say that at the end of these, I guess.